Right, welcome guys. Before we get into any sort of practical stuff, I wanted to just take one or two videos just to kind of go over some core concepts and just look at some different options when it comes to sampling. Samplers come in all different shapes and sizes. For some of the work that we're going to be doing later, you're really going to want like one of the more sort of pro level samplers. But let's just take a look at some examples. Basically, most of you should be sort of aware what a sampler is doing. At its most basic form, you've got something like the Cubase. Cubase's built-in track sampler. This one is super simple. You just literally just drag in a file and it maps it over the keyboard, and you have a number of options available to you, from looping to pitch envelopes, filters, etc., time stretching, and so on. Now that's just at its simplest form. There's not a whole lot you can do with this when it comes to more complex multi-sampled instruments. If you have a copy of Anna, this is another great way to get into sampling as well. It's also a very simple sampler, much like Cubase's built-in sampling. You have sample waveforms available on Anna, sample oscillators, where you can load your own custom samples in and they get mapped across the keyboard as well. The benefit of doing it inside of Anna, though, is that you can combine them with the oscillators and modulation and filters and stuff inside Anna. So it's a far more complex setup. And that is one of these sample oscillators running there. So this is a great option as well for sort of basic stuff. Again, to be doing sort of complex multi-samples, you're going to want something a little bit more detailed and capable. So let's just close that one down, and very briefly, the sort of second type of sampler that you're going to be looking at later on in the tutorial as well is a drum sampler. Again, this one, pretty much everybody should have one of these built into their DAW. These predominantly work off pads with your samples inside each pad. This is Groove Agent. You can see there's multiple velocity layers and stuff in here. You can have multiple samples with different settings for each sample and stretched out across the keyboard via the pads over here. But we'll come into these a little bit more detailed later on. Now let's just get to the my sampler of choice is Falcon for my own personal work when I'm sampling stuff. I just find the workflow a lot better. Plus, you have the benefit of the synthesis engine that's inside it as well, which is incredibly detailed. But let's just take a look at probably one of the most popular ones out there, and largely because the libraries that you can get for Contact make this one so popular. It's definitely got the largest selection of external libraries that you can purchase for Contact. But I just want to kind of just briefly run through the sort of structure of a patch and just show you the similarities between this and Falcon, seeing as we're going to be working in Falcon for most of this tutorial. So let's just open up a new instrument. I'm not very keen on Contact's UI either, so that's probably why I prefer to work with Falcon. So let's just quickly just look through the setup of a patch, just the architecture of any patch that you're going to be creating. So just at a first glance, you have different sections here. This is your sample section over here. You have different options that you can go through at the top. We'll just quickly run through these. Instrument options, that's just a dialog that opens up with a bunch of options that you can set with regards to streaming from disk and voice handling, etc. The group editor is where you set up groups of samples. These could potentially be used for setting up key switches. Key switches or different articulations when you're sampling sort of more acoustic instruments or whatever. So you have various different groups that contain various different samples. Now we move over to the mapping editor. This is where you would set up your samples and map them across the keyboard with the various velocity layers and zones for each sample. And then the wave editor does exactly that. It's the waves. This is where you would set up loop points for samples, loop points and fades and things for the release times. You have a number of different things you can do here, from slicing them to looping them to actually editing the sample itself. And then lastly, and these ones can actually you can actually load an external wave editor from here as well, but not available when I'm running it inside the DAW. And then the script editor, we're going to just briefly talk about that in the next video as well. But it's a bit out of the scope of this tutorial, so I'll just show you where it is for now. We'll come back to that in a bit. And then you have your effects, the group insert effects. These are applied directly to a specific group of samples or whatever you have loaded in your mapping editor. These are applied to that specific group. So the group as well, you could split your groups if you wanted specific effects applied to specific keys. You would split your groups into different sections that you can apply different effects on different groups. And then you have your insert effects. These are very much the same as insert effects on your channel. They're applied to the entire patch. And then your send effects, exactly the same as you would have send effects in your DAW. You can send like a reverb, for example. You can have this loaded in here. And lastly, your modulation page is at the bottom. You have by default a volume envelope set up. You can add modulators as you see fit, different whatever you need, velocity sensitive stuff. You can add in more envelopes, etc., for filters and so on. But we're not going to get into that too much, but just so you know where everything is. And I just wanted to point these out because a lot of this is very similar in Falcon, even though they do seem quite different at first glance. There's a lot of similarities in how these sounds are actually set up. So let's just jump into Falcon quickly and take a look at how a patch works in this. So on the left, you have your parts. Parts are essentially, you can have multiple parts for different channels. It's essentially the same as an instrument in Contact. So we're going to pop into the tree view here so you can kind of see how it all fits together. The part, we're going to add a new program. So that would be a preset of this instrument that we're making. And fold that one open as well. You would add a layer, which is essentially the same as a group, a sample group in Contact. And additionally, you can add a key group. So the key group is where your samples will be loaded in. The difference with Falcon is that your key groups can actually contain actual oscillators as well. You have a number of different options. So you have your sampling oscillators. By default, dragging in samples will set up a sample oscillator like that. But you also have the added benefit of having a wavetable oscillator, all these different pluck drum oscillators, analog stacks, etc. So you can actually combine analog synthesis or wavetable synthesis to your samples as well, which gives you a vast amount of possibilities when it comes to sound design. When it comes to the effects as well, very much the same as Contact. You have different layers of effects. You can actually check all these out by enabling the effects tabs are currently enabled. When you have a key group, you can add effects to the key group itself, which would be done here. You can add in effects. So compressors, for example, you can add a compressor directly to the samples themselves. And then you have your insert effects, which would be on the layer. You can add those in here, say whatever, EQ. And then you have your program effects as well, which are for the entire patch. You can have multiple different layers or groups if you were working in Contact. And then you can have insert effects applied to the entire preset as well, which would cover the whole thing. As well as sends, you can also set up sends inside of this. So that's basically just an overview of just the structure. I just wanted to run through that in case you are not familiar with these sort of more pro-level samplers. Other options that you can look at for this is something like Steinberg's Hallion, or Motu's Mach 5, I think it is. But yeah, Contact's going to be the one that you see the most, and I'd highly recommend actually checking this out. It's not a cheap piece of kit, but the possibilities that you have with this is just insane. It's a steep learning curve, but really, really good when it comes to doing more detailed stuff. So we're going to cut it off there. I'm going to just briefly talk about scripting in the next video, and then we'll move on to actually creating some templates for sampling and getting our samplers set up for multi-sampling. Cool. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers.
Thanks everybody for watching, commenting, and indeed liking. We really do appreciate all the support we get here on our Sonic Academy YouTube channel. So if you found this video super useful, please, we'd love you to hit the subscribe button. We update the YouTube channel every week with new content. And if you want to watch some more relevant content, just click on the videos beside me.